I'm pleased to introduce Bea Arneson, who is moderating this panel on making the case for abolition. Bea is a doctoral researcher at the University of Edinburgh and former program director at the World Peace Foundation. Welcome, Bea.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the panel Making the Case for Abolition. First, I'd like to thank Greta and World Beyond War for all of their incredible work on this conference. I know how much effort you all put in, and you've done an incredible job so far. We're thrilled to have all of you joining us from different places to participate in this vital conversation. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge our sponsor, the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation, for supporting this event. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Michael Knox, representing the foundation, to offer a few brief remarks.
Thank you, Bea, and Greta, and World Beyond War. Hello, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to share a few words about the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit established 20 years ago to honor and celebrate Americans who actively worked to end U.S. war and militarism. Ending the U.S. war culture starts by honoring those who speak out against it. The U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation is the only organization solely dedicated to recognizing anti-war heroes in the U.S., the leaders and activists whose example inspires others to work for peace. We highlight these inspiring role models and their important work through our U.S. Peace Registry and the prestigious U.S. Peace Prize, which honors the most outstanding and prominent anti-war leaders each year. World Beyond War won the U.S. Peace Prize in 2021, and its co-founder and executive director, David Swanson, was selected in 2018. The World Beyond War board president, the Honorable Kathy Kelly, was the 2015 recipient. So World Beyond War is well represented over these past 2 decades. Learn about us and those people, those heroes that we celebrate at uspeacememorial.org. We're excited to participate in this outstanding annual conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Knox, and thank you so much for your support for this panel. The present moment is marked by a deepening sense of crisis and an expansion of state power across multiple fronts. Policing and prison systems continue to grow in scope and authority, tightening their grip on communities long targeted by state violence. In the US, agencies like ICE are violently detaining and deporting our loved ones. And at the same time, we're witnessing a genocide in Palestine carried out with the backing of governments that rely on the same logics of control and disposability that sustain prisons and policing. These are not separate struggles, but interlocking, racialized, and gendered violences carried out to gain and preserve capital. In this moment, it remains essential to continue the work of abolition, not only as a critique of existing systems, but as a practice of building communities grounded in hope and care. And we're really honored today to be joined by 2 leading voices in the global abolitionist movement, whose work continues to imagine and enact these possibilities. Andrea Ritchie is a writer, organizer, researcher, and network weaver, and co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization. Andrea is the author of Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, and Practicing New Worlds, Abolition and Emergent Strategies, and a co-author of several other books. Ray Atchison is an organizer, activist, and writer. They are the director of Reaching Critical Will and author of Abolishing State Violence, A World Beyond Bombs, Borders, and Cages, and Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. From 2008 to 2024, Ray served on the steering group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work to ban nuclear weapons. Thank you both for being here. We'll now turn to our panelists who will share a brief reflection on what abolition means to them within their respective areas of focus. Andrea, would you like to start?
I was hoping Ray would, but I will jump in. Um, Thank you so much, B, for the introduction, for the really generative questions I'm looking forward to diving into, and to World Beyond War for hosting this conversation and thinking through these questions of abolition in the context of what you're describing, which is sort of global expressions of violence at levels and at the scope that are dizzying, to say the least, and it can be difficult to think about abolition in those contexts. Where we're thinking about genocides, multiple genocides, where we're thinking about multiple planet-threatening or human life on Earth threatening, and other forms of life on Earth threatening climate events, etc. So grateful to be sort of thinking through abolition in that context. In addition to the things that you said about me in my introduction, I did want to sort of identify myself as someone who is a Black woman, a lesbian, a survivor of interpersonal, community, and state violence, and a migrant to the United States and daughter of a migrant to Canada from the Caribbean, because those things may also not be immediately apparent from looking at me, but also because they have deeply shaped my trajectory towards abolition and why I've become an abolitionist and the way in which my abolitionist practice and theory and practice sort of have come to be. And particularly as a survivor of violence and a daughter of survivor of violence and a granddaughter of survivors of violence, because I think often we sort of juxtapose abolition and survivorship as things in contradiction, when in fact what's really critical for people to understand is that abolition is a survivor-led movement. It is a movement led by particularly survivors of all the forms of violence, state, interpersonal, community, who live at the dangerous intersections of race, gender, sexuality, imperialism, capitalism, and so on, for whom the state has never been a source of safety and has always been a central organizer of the violence that we experience, even if it's the violence we experience at home and in community. So for me and for us, abolition is a vision and a practice of a world free from violence of all kinds, including the violence of policing, punishment, incarceration, detention, exile. And the ways in which I'm practicing that right now are at Interrupting Criminalization, an organization that I co-founded with an abolitionist, Black feminist abolitionist many of you have heard of, Mariam Kaba. And we founded it in 2018 during the first iteration of this US administration and kind of world order or rising wave of authoritarianism around the world, because as Black feminist abolitionists and survivors, anti-capitalists, anti-war. I was thinking when I was coming to this conference that actually took my first arrest at an anti-war demonstration. So it feels like coming home in many ways. But as Black feminist abolitionists, we understood that policing, punishment, and criminalization are central to advancing right-wing authoritarian and fascist agendas, regimes, and practices. And so it was really important for us to interrupt, to literally interrupt the process of criminalization that is at the center of how authoritarianism and fascism work. It's not just how authoritarian and fascist regimes silence their enemies. It's actually just how they function and how they manufacture consent for what they're doing, how they cow people into complying in advance, and how people sort of understand and allow many levels of violence to be normalized. So it's a process that normalizes a certain level of state violence under what we would call regular conditions or regular neoliberalism. And then when that level of violence is just turned up to 11 under fascism and authoritarianism, the rationale is still one of criminalization, whether we're talking about in Gaza, for instance, where everyone from newborns to nonagenarians is framed as literally by the state, the Zionist entity, the occupying entity, as a terrorist. By definition, that is a political process of criminalization that, taken to its most extreme form, produces genocide, right? That groups of people are framed as inherent threats to a desired or imagined social order and structure of relations of power, and then the way in which to justify, in this case, literal exterminatory expulsion-based violence is to criminalize people and to frame them as inherently criminal and inherently threatening, inherently dangerous, and therefore denying people food, medical care, all those things are legitimized by the process of criminalization. So we formed Interrupting Criminalization to sort of highlight those realities, to invite people into interrupting it wherever it happens, wherever we see it, and to invite ourselves to imagine otherwise, right? So I often think of criminalization as the antithesis of care. It is the opposite of a society premised on care, mutual accountability, what Insight, Feminists of Color Against Violence describes as a world premised on mutual accountability, passionate reciprocity, and the liberation of all peoples. Criminalization gets in the way of that at every step and in every way. And at the same time, we understand from Black feminists that care is the antidote to violence. So the idea behind abolition is not just tearing down systems of violence, disrupting the notion and the practice of criminalization that produces it and makes it possible. It's also building practices, institutions, and societies and whole social contracts and planetary contracts that are rooted in care for ourselves, for each other, and the planet that we live on. So it is a global vision. It is a global practice. It is a necessarily internationalist, transnational practice, and it is necessarily one that will produce a world beyond war if we practice it and take it to its logical conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll move to Ray, and then we'll go into some discussion questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for whatever questions that you have.
Great, thanks, Bea, and also thanks, Andrea, for kicking us off against your will. And yeah, I liked how you started and framed your sort of personal relationship to this work, and I hadn't really thought about doing that, but I'm also an immigrant, non-binary, queer, incarcerated family, survivor of violence. So yeah, my abolitionist politics are both political and personal, and I think it is important to recognize that when we're thinking through the structures that we're up against and the communities that we're trying to build together. A lot of my work focuses on trying to stop the global war machine and the weapons and the war profiteering that sustain it. And so a lot of my work focuses on nuclear abolition. As Bea mentioned, I've been part of the campaign to abolish nuclear weapons for decades. And I think nuclear weapons are often kind of outside of a lot of the other structures of state violence that abolitionists are working on and thinking about and consider. But I do think that there's, a key element that's really relevant for a lot of these other conversations and movements that we're building, especially in the ways that nuclear weapons are both sort of this ultimate symbol of control and domination and fear and intimidation, but also have this very brutal material reality of the harm that they generate every single day, from uranium mining to production and testing and radioactive waste, etc., all of which is really colonial and done mostly on indigenous lands and waters around the world. But also, of course, then the ultimate harm that would come from nuclear weapons if they were detonated or if there were a nuclear war. And so they work on multiple levels that I think bring in a lot of issues, concepts, structures that are relevant to other elements of abolition. I mean, the whole theory of nuclear deterrence, right? We can think of that in the context of other deterrence theories, whether that's, deterrence in crime, right? In terms of the three strikes you're out policies, or prison somehow being a deterrent, or borders being a deterrent to migration. It's this concept of deterrence is really based on exclusion and death and harm, rather than anything that actually brings security to people around the world. Another part of my work that I wanted to talk about today is also on abolishing the global arms trade and the abolishing the profiteering that happens from the weapons producers and exporters. And so a lot of this work over the last 2 years, of course, has focused on trying to stop arms transfers to Israel in the context of genocide. But that's not the only conflict. As Andrea said, there are multiple genocides, multiple armed conflicts happening. And so a lot of that work is, supporting the BDS movement, the Mask Off Maersk campaign, the student encampments for divestment, and bringing all that internationally, trying to work with governments like those that have formed the Hague Group and other coalitions of states that want to be able to stand up to the warmongers and the war profiteers in some way without being then overthrown by the U.S. government, which often happens when one stands up to these countries. And then the third focus of my work that I thought might be relevant for folks to think about is that we're trying to stop the creation of new weapons, because as if we don't have enough violence in the world, now there are algorithms and artificial intelligence. And we are seeing the ways that AI systems are being used to destroy democracy, if democracy exists, but are definitely hastening its end, are being used to surveil, to incarcerate, to discriminate in so many different ways. But these technologies are also being increasingly incorporated into weapon systems. And so we're trying to prevent the development of autonomous weapons or killer robots, which would be operating without human control. We're already starting to see AI be incorporated into weapon targeting systems. So we've seen Israel do this in Gaza. And we're trying to stop the incorporation of AI into nuclear command and control systems, if you can imagine this. I mean, it's hard to believe that some of this is real, that we don't have enough sci-fi in the world to warn us that this is all a really bad idea, but here we are. And I think what's important for me in this global anti-war, anti-weapon work that I do is that I'm always trying to connect it directly to other abolitionist struggles that I work on and support locally, so including of police, prisons, detention, borders, and everything else. The way that the US government is currently waging a war on terror, really, within the United States now, declaring all of us terrorists for speaking out against oppression or against capitalism, or speaking out for trans rights, or engaging in mutual aid even is now a terrorist act. This war is being fought with the same weapons that the US profits from exporting to conflicts around the world, or that it uses in its own unlawful military operations. I read something yesterday that ICE is acquiring guided missiles. Really? Yeah, this is where we're at. And this war against the cities and people within the US is reaching, of course, extreme levels. But I think, it's also important to recognize this isn't just a Trump thing. This isn't just a Republican thing. The militarization of police within the United States has been going on for decades. Cop City in Atlanta started under Biden. The Stop Cop City movement was repressed under a Democratic mayor of Atlanta, working with the Republican governor of Georgia. ICE has been increasingly funded by successive Republican and Democratic administrations. And the repression of movements for Black lives, against police brutality, for immigrant rights, this is all really bipartisan. And so, like Andrea was saying, we have state violence, and now it's being turned up to 11 under fascism, yes. But we need to recognize that this isn't new. And I think that's helpful because we have been fighting this a long time. People have survived these systems of violence. People have built community. And as far as I can see, abolition offers us the most clear, the most connected and collaborative way out of the mess that we are in now. Because abolition fundamentally is about seeking justice and building community and building alternative structures. It has a vision of how the world can be. And it's not just one vision, it's like a co-constituted vision, right? It's something we're crafting together all the time about the relationships and the institutions and the actions that we need to turn this ship around. And so the systems of oppressions and the billionaires and the political elite and everybody else that's benefiting from these systems of harm, they're all really connected. And so we need to be as well. Thank you.
We are really starting off on a strong pathway. Thank you both so much for your incredible insights. We'll move into some discussion questions. I'll pose a couple of questions and I invite you both to sort of respond and build on each other's insights. I do also want to encourage participants to use the Q&A function. I'm sure many of you already have questions for our panelists. Andrea and Ray, I know both of you advocate for abolition rather than reform, and I know this is quite a fundamental question that you're probably asked all of the time, but I still think it's really important for us to ask this question and come back to this because there's so many reformist practices that get put as an option that are not actually inherently abolitionists. So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about why you're advocating for abolition rather than something like reform? And, you know, we have this sort of non-reformist reforms and reformist reforms. And if you could speak a little bit to, you know, what does taking steps forward look like versus doing reformist practices? And since we made Andrea go first, Ray, I'm going to have you go first this time.
Yeah, sure. So when I think about reform versus abolition, I mean, I think the pushback that we often get here, right, is that some people think this means that we want to snap our fingers and magically the systems of oppression will disappear. Whereas, you know, abolitionists working particularly in the police and prison abolition space really have a great analysis of this concept of reformist reforms versus non-reformist reforms, which is really terrible language. We can be honest about that. But it, as a concept, it's very useful because what it is distinguishing between reforms that tweak a system of harm that really make it maybe more palatable to like an audience that isn't really paying attention, but actually do nothing to dismantle that system of harm or move us away to a new way of thinking or operating in the world, versus non-reformist reforms, which are actually steps that get us to go in the direction that we want to go. So one of the sort of clearest examples of this in terms of, say, policing is when we're calling for reforms like training police not to be racist or giving them body cameras. These are actually things that invest more money into the structure of policing and don't do anything to challenge the overall nature of policing or recognize that policing, particularly in settler colonial states, is inherently a racist institution based on how they're being created to commit genocide of indigenous people and you know, go after escaped enslaved people, etc. And so it ignores all of that and it plays around the edges of things. I think, you know, then in sort of a counter to that, when we're talking about the non-reformist reforms, we're talking about taking away or diminishing the police budget and investing it instead into alternative community responses in various ways. When I'm thinking about it in relation to, say, the work that I do on nuclear weapons, it's the same sort of idea. So when we're talking about nuclear arms control, I think of that as a reformist reform. It results in more money going into the nuclear weapons stockpile for modernization in the name of keeping the stockpile secure and reliable, etc. And we might get some reductions in arsenal size or a budget, or we might, you know, eliminate one type of weapon systems or something. We're not actually eliminating nuclear weapons. We're not actually on the path to abolishing these weapons in the countries that possess them. And it actually ends up reinforcing the concept of nuclear deterrence because it suggests that we can actually have deterrence, but we can have it at a lower level. Russia and the United States don't need thousands of nuclear weapons. They just maybe need a few hundred. And that leaves all of the structures of nuclear weapon production in place. And so you can draw these analogies for anything that we're working on, but happy to turn it over to Andrea to add to that.
Feel free, Andrea. Thank you, Ray.
As soon as I find that mute button. Everything Ray said for sure, but I think, someone is naming that they feel like the things that we're saying are not translatable to the average person. And something that is translatable to the average person is that reform doesn't work. We have been doing it for 200 years, and the violence of policing is increasing, not decreasing. So that's as plainly as I can say it. Like, we have doubled down. We have tried it this way. We have tried it that way. If you look at the recommendations of the Wickersham Commission, which is one of the first commissions in the United States to examine the violence of policing following, police riots in New York City, the recommendations are literally almost verbatim to the same that were made by the president's task force on 21st century policing, under the Obama administration. And I know of which I speak because I've tried as, a lawyer and a policy advocate, and I've won cases where, I got to participate in the process of kind of rewriting the New York City Police Department's patrol guide with respect to how it interacts. Police were supposed to interact with trans and gender nonconforming people and LGBT people more broadly. And I can tell you, you can have the best thing in writing and a commitment, and literally the next day I'm getting the same calls from people experiencing the same thing. So I'll just say it as plainly as possible. Reform doesn't work because we are trying to make policing and punishment into something they're not. They're doing exactly what they were created to do, which is to manufacture and enable a society based on racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and extraction from the planet and from people and their labor. And so it's functioning quite well. And any attempt to reform it, when we wrote No More Police, Mariam really insisted on the chapter on reform being spelled re-form, because anytime we try and do something new, we just redo it in the same way. And sometimes that happens with the things that we envision as quote unquote alternatives to police, because if we think about an alternative to police, we still have police in our brain, right? And we're just trying to make it look different. T-shirts, friendlier, use the right pronouns, right? Like, but same function, same ultimate role, same enforcement of criminalization in whichever form is serving society in the moment. So I think I just wanted to say it as plainly as possible. As someone who has tried it, who has, found myself sometimes thinking, oh, this is a non-reformist reform, and then been like, oh, no, turns out it's a reformist reform or an ineffective reform, both of them, right? And so it is really a practice of discernment, what is actually going to actually reduce the violence of policing and actually create the systems of care and support that bring us closer to the world that we want. So I'll give an example, for instance, in the context of decriminalization of controlled substances in some places, like whether it's British Columbia or Oregon. People will say, oh, we tried that and it was a failure, right? And part of the reason, the things that they're pointing to are the product of an absence or a failure to do the second part of what Ray was saying, right? Which is we need to divest from policing resources, legitimacy, power, weapons, etc. But we also need to invest in the things that policing and punishment and the carceral state have looted of resources, right, to build the machine that they have. And so if we don't invest in the care part, and that requires way more than, a fraction of a police budget to make the world that doesn't produce policing possible, then we're not going to get there. So I think that's a really critical part too, when people are saying, well, can you point to somewhere where it's worked? We haven't done the whole thing anywhere. So we're doing our best. We can certainly point to examples. Frankly, everyone in their lives can point to an example of when they have addressed a conflict, harm, or need without calling the police. You probably did it multiple times today, right? So there was a way of doing it. And those of us who are more resourced or live in communities or countries or spaces that are more resourced, it's much more possible to do that because you have access to other options. And so abolition really is a invitation to make a multitude of options available that can prevent, interrupt, heal from, and transform the conditions that produce the harm in the first place. And I really just want to appreciate, Ray, how you're applying these things to the world war machine, because I think that we do think sometimes I wholeheartedly agree with you that when it comes to international politics, or when it comes to war machine or nuclear things, we somehow think that we can reform our way out of a society built on militarism, nuclear power, nuclear deterrence, by just having more inspections. And we need to be clear that it's the same logic that we need to apply.
Thank you so much. I think this next question would be a great segue into some of the questions that are already being asked in the Q&A, which thank you so much, everyone, for submitting those. So abolitionists often emphasize that abolition isn't just about like tearing down existing systems of violence like prisons and borders and militarism, but it's equally important to imagine and create these alternatives to those systems. And Andrea, you were just speaking about that. And I think it would be really helpful. I know you mentioned, like people are practicing these activities of care every day, right? But I'm wondering if each of you could give an example of how you have seen a form of care in your community that took place instead of a form of policing or prisons or militarization. And Andrea, we'll start with you first, and then we'll go back to Ray.
I mean, I'll give one example that I've often used, but there are literally millions of them, right? But this happened in New York City many years ago, but someone told me about how a young woman was being sexually harassed on a bus and by a man on the bus. And everyone on the bus reached back to hand her their cell phone to call the police. As opposed to everyone on the bus being like, okay, homie, that's not how we relate to people. We don't do that. One group of people is going to take you over here and have a conversation with you about like what motivated you to do that. Where did you learn that? How would you feel if that was done to you? Is there another way? Like, can we transform the conditions that produce this harm? And another group of people would have surrounded her and said, what do you need right now? We're so sorry this happened to you. We're committed to making it so that you can ride this bus safely going forward. What do you need? What do you need in this moment? How would you need in the future? If you don't know, that's fine. We'll come back together at the bus stop tomorrow and ride with you back and forth until we can figure it out together. Like, it's just that simple, right? That we're not trying to delegate to a system of violence and people who only have like 3 tools, like handcuffs, cages, and a baton, or a gun, or some form of harm to address complicated issues in our communities, whether we're talking about the most serious forms of violence or, a conflict on the street. And I'll say, a million times on my block, people were fighting and we all went out there and sorted it out, because we were like, if we don't sort it out, these guys are going to come and sort it out, and someone's going to leave the block tonight, maybe multiple people, and someone might not live. So we are committed to sorting it out, because there's another option that means much worse. So I think that's one example, but I want to make it that simple so people understand that it is everyday practices. Now, that's not enough. We need to, build institutions and skills and new ways of relating to each other, not just interpersonally, but economically, socially, politically, globally. But it really is it is as simple as asking ourselves, in each and every interaction, is this interaction premised on care, compassion, and accountability? Notice that in that example, we didn't all just let homie go or kick him off the bus and then let him go do it on another bus, right? Like, it is actually a place where there's actually more accountability, more prevention, more opportunity to end the violence or stop the violence than a punishment or an exile. And I think that's, again, why saying abolition is a survivor-led movement, is because survivors deserve more and better than what this system is offering right now. And we demand it. And that's why we are working towards a world without it.
Thank you. And I super appreciate the example that you gave, because I think a lot of times we try to make these cases overly complex, right? Ray, would you like to add on to this question?
Yeah, I think, I was really inspired by the mutual aid networks that were set up during COVID. I live in New York City in South Brooklyn, and the South Brooklyn Mutual Aid Group really sprung into action quickly. And there was sort of this sense at that time that the state had abdicated responsibility for what was happening to folks who were not able to access food, and it was really neighbors providing for neighbors. And then, after the lockdowns had sort of eased up and we had vaccines, and then there was the manufactured crisis at the border, and suddenly, like the Texas governor was shipping people in buses up to Chicago and New York and stuff. And then so we were able to pivot towards providing for our new immigrant neighbors. And so I think that kind of action, that kind of organized action is really incredible to watch. And the more people that are involved, the more can come out and pitch in when you are in those moments of crisis or pivot. But I also think what's really inspiring me right now is the much less organized response that we're seeing to ICE on the streets. The way that people are not letting their neighbors be taken, and the ways that people, I think, are understanding that police aren't helping, like what this administration is doing is unlawful, and the police are not engaging in protecting people that are being attacked by ICE. Even in some cases, we've seen video of the Chicago police being pepper sprayed by ICE, but this isn't like turning into um, anything other than what it's always been, which is we protect each other on these streets. And so I do think that there's a lot to look at right now with how people are responding, and how we can get organized more and more in each of our different locations, but learning from what's happening across the country, and what has happened in other countries as well, because the US is certainly not the first country to deal with disappearances of people like this. And I was just reading Kelly Hayes' latest newsletter before I hopped on this call, and I always look to Kelly Hayes' writing and podcasts for guidance in these difficult moments. And her newsletter today was sort of thinking through, this concept of it being too late, right? Because we can feel very overwhelmed, and we're constantly told it's too late. And I think this applies to the work that we're all doing right now. Um, and so I just wanted to quote one thing she said, but I'd recommend the whole newsletter. And she says, "Our story isn't over, nor is it singular. The moment of crisis contains countless stories of struggle, resistance, and harm that might still be interrupted. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by the vastness of it all, remember that every intervention, every site of contestation, every kindness and act of courage matters."
Thank you, Ray. That was really beautiful. Um, I feel like you're speaking to some really important aspects of how we can continue to engage in this work. So I guess my next question, and I'll add a sort of secondary question that comes from the audience. Both of you have sustained movements through really difficult times. Obviously, this is, I feel like we've been in an ongoing difficult time, but it seems to be really a lot of people are feeling very fearful. And I really appreciate, Ray, your commentary on manufactured crisis, because I think that's what we're dealing with more often than not. But what have you learned about, maintaining activist energy and commitment over the long haul, and what might be valuable for people doing organizing today? And I think I'll just add from the audience, someone is very interested on how do we engage youth more in our movement. Ray, would you like to start?
Yeah. I think, as organizers, as activists, we need to have a long view. I think there is, in the sort of consumer individualistic culture that we live in, there is like this trend towards needing immediate gratification, or you need to see the results of your efforts. And um, it can happen. You can see things right away change, and certainly in a interpersonal sense, you can see change, um, quite quickly. But we face a lot of backtracking. We face a lot of tiny victories. We face a lot of pushback, the whole one step forward, 500 steps back. I mean, we're in that moment right now, right? So I think that maintaining both for yourself, but also projecting where possible, the attitude that um, change is absolutely possible. And we need to work for it as if we're going to enjoy the fruits of it tomorrow, even though we know that we might not. Um, we have an obligation to try. We have an obligation to resist. We have an obligation to struggle. We have an obligation to find joy with each other and keep going. Um, and we have an obligation to all of that, even if we have no sense that we're going to be successful in the near term. We have an obligation to that, even in the face of certain defeat, I would say. And maybe that's like a very Albert Camus thing to say. But I think that where I find a lot of my ability to keep going is to not think about, will this work, but to think about, is this the right thing to do? And I think that guides a lot of my actions. And I think that it also is really important to remember that we have changed a lot of things in the world. We have banned a lot of really terrible things. We have unbanned a lot of really good things. And for all the backlash that we face, for all of the struggle that it takes to achieve those changes, and for all of the imperfections of those changes, because we certainly haven't dismantled the big structures that are still causing harm, we have done a lot of good work, and none of those changes would have happened without people struggling for it. They never would have, it's not the benevolence of the state that eliminates things that are harmful or that gives us rights. It's the actions of everyday people, ordinary people around the world struggling for it that has made any change. And so if we have any hope, which I believe that we do, then that's only going to come through our struggle.
I appreciate that. And I always appreciate the reminders that we're in this for the long haul. Andrea, would you like to add on to what Ray was saying?
I just went out down a Camus hole, but in my mind, but it actually reminded
It happens. It happens to the best
I know.
of us.
It's like my teenage self suddenly. But I think, I'm also reminded with that about the start of N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, Black feminist sci-fi writer, where, it starts, the world has already ended. Now what? Kind of, right? And it was this notion that we lean into possibility in the face of the world that we know ending means that other worlds are possible and opening up, right? And that there's always a sense of possibility. And if you read through the whole trilogy, which is a meditation on grief and worlds ending, you realize that we fight till the very end because we are human and because we love each other and we love ourselves and we love the earth that we're part of. And we just never know what that will yield, even just in the transformation of ourselves and each other. So, I think creativity and joy and imagination is what keeps us in, and also this practice of care, right? Which is that I get really excited trying to think about, okay, what else could we do? What could we do different? And then doing experimentation. If you're not trying to solve the whole problem in one thing, which will freeze you in a fear of failure, and you're just trying to do one positive step, right? Then what could that be? What's the next most elegant step? What's the next thing that we could try that would be an experiment that might unlock a key to the next thing? It's like, it's like Zelda, I think, that's how we bring young people in. One of my neighbors, my young neighbors, was watching Zelda, and I was like, oh, that's actually like abolition, right? There's a moment where like you have to figure out that you have to tilt the thing a particular way in order to get something, but you just have to keep trying things until you're like, oh, if we tilt it this way, we can go this way. Like, and that can be, a joyful practice if you're eliminating the fear of failure and you're eliminating the pressure coming from people who are like, you must solve every problem of racial capitalism and climate collapse and all of the fallout of neoliberalism before we'll let go of this other thing that is definitely killing us and definitely not working for the things that we want. And you have to do that, between 3 and 5 a.m. between your 6 jobs with no money. And if you can't do that, then we're not buying your abolitionist thing. And it's like, okay, do you see how ridiculous you sound, right? And instead, to not take on like we have to fix everything, but we have to practice the things that'll bring us closer to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And that's sort of what my most recent book, Practicing New Worlds, Abolition and Emergent Strategies, is trying to offer, is that we change the world by acting within it. Octavia Butler and many people who grow from her talk about like we shape change, change shapes us, right? And so how can we shape change even just in the world that we're in? And how can we do that in ways that bring joy and creativity? Like we bring young people in by being like, so if policing was Zelda, like, or whatever, right? I'm not saying Zelda is an abolitionist game because there's a lot of violence in it, but how do we make it, something that we can experiment with and play with, and be in experimentation together, that we make it relevant to them. I mean, there's so many ways to bring young people in. There's a group called, Radical Monarchs or Queenie's Crew, where they practice abolition in their play, where teenagers, we bring them in through various experiments. And I think many times they're way ahead of us and they're sort of like, okay, wow, this wasn't always true. Like, can you catch up to us? And we'll lead the way. So I think that's important. I think that the other thing that feels important is we have to make spaces of sense making. I feel like right now it's dizzying what's going on all the time, by intention, by design, right? And the world is happening at a very fast pace, and Kelly and Mariam and many others here talk about like we're not designed as humans to receive this much information or to watch this much violence and trauma, to know all this at the same time. And we need to find places to come together to make sense of things and to make the connections, like that between the work that Ray's doing, the work I'm doing, and the work that other folks are doing, and spaces of fortification, to believe that what's possible, to have faith in ourselves and in each other. I think someone posted in the chat that like, well, the bus example was cute, but that would require a lot of training and preparation beforehand. It's like, would it? Like, do we, like, we've lost faith in ourselves, and the state has like de-skilled us in the notion that we can care for ourselves and each other, and made us believe that we have to rely on the state in a way that then gives them control over us. Like, yes, de-escalation training is helpful, anti-violence training is helpful. I'm not saying we should go into situations. We need skills, we need relationships, we need institutions, infrastructures, but also we don't need all of that. We don't need a PhD in abolition to say, hey, that's not okay. And I would really ask you to stop that. And if you can't, then we're gonna have to figure out a way to share this space without you being able to do harm. Like, we can intervene, we can act. And I think we need to have spaces where we believe we reinforce our faith in ourselves and each other, and just in the possibility of change. So, I'm an atheist, I've been for a long time, but I know that faith in various forms has gotten many people through many times, including watching the faith that, Palestinians in Gaza are hanging on to for dear life in every moment, right? And I think if we have a faith in that another future is possible, that another world is possible, and that it lies in each of our hearts and actions, and then we practice that together, I think that can be something that can be fortifying and keep people going, along with kind of practicing our imagination, in times like this. And then just remembering, like, one thing ending opens possibilities for another. This is a portal. I'm not going back to what was. Too much suffering has already happened. Too many people have already, we've lost in so many ways. We've lost too much in so many ways. We have to come out the other side with a better world. And so how can we practice doing that now?
Thank you so much. I super appreciate all of the very nerdy references. I agree that that's how we get more young people involved. Okay, so we've answered some of your questions in the chat, but we'll do sort of what I'll call a rapid fire answering session because we have so many great questions. And again, please use the Q&A function and when you're submitting a question, just because it's easier for me to monitor. Thank you so much for doing that. So let's start off with a question around the military-industrial complex. So this person says the military-industrial complex employs many high-paying jobs. How do we provide jobs for those people if there's no longer a military-industrial complex? And Ray, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, this is an interesting thing that cuts across, again, a number of abolitionist struggles, because the same arguments that we hear about jobs in the economy in relation to the military-industrial complex, we also hear about prisons, we hear them about detention centers, right? Like these facilities are going to come to your area, they're going to employ a lot of people, they're going to bolster the local economy, it's going to be good for the communities involved. And what we've seen across studies done on any of these cases is that it's actually the opposite is true. The idea of like the trickle down economics from these industries of harm to local communities is just incredibly untrue. And when it comes to the military industrial complex, yeah, they are mostly high-paying jobs. They're jobs for folks that have degrees in physics and chemistry and engineering and whatnot. And these facilities, these weapons contractors or the nuclear weapon labs, they're really plugged into the university systems as well. So there's these pipelines that go from the universities to these industries, and they don't really allow for students to consider other opportunities. It's just they get sucked in. And we're seeing that increasingly now with the tech industry, as well as so many tech companies are getting contracts with the military industrial complex as well, for AI weapons, for drones, autonomous weapons, etc. So this is now involving students in other disciplines as well that get sucked through this pipeline. So I think there's a lot of different ways to address this question. Part of me, I don't know that it's the job of the abolitionists to find jobs for the people making weapons that kill people. I think that might be one way to approach this question. I do think that there's a lot of work that's been done over many years, since the 60s and onwards in the United States about conversion of the military industries to more socially and economically and politically productive industries. So it's not like starting the wheel again there. But we have a lot of problems that we need to solve, right? We have a lot of problems, whether that's mitigating climate change or dealing with the ecological destruction that we've already caused, or dealing with myriad of social issues that the forces of capitalism have created globally. And so I think for me, it's less about finding a job for a specific worker who's making weapons and more about what it is that we're building in the place and what kind of skills and what kind of industries or technologies or opportunities do we need to be building through the other work that we're doing. But I'm happy to hear what others have to say about this as well, because I think, in networks like World Beyond War, I think there's a lot of folks that have done work on conversion in the past away from military industries.
Yeah, and if you have responses to that, I mean, there is a pretty active chat going on, so please feel free to put sort of your responses to Ray in the chat. Andrea, do you have anything to add to what Ray was saying?
Yeah, we rarely say different things, but I actually think it is our job to think about. And I think if we don't, and we talked about this in No More Police, it's not our favorite thing about this work, but if we don't contend with the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are employed as law enforcement officer, like agents in the state, not plus the whole machinery that surrounds them and the people they're in relationship with, then we don't really have a chance to address it. So when I was working on nuclear issues as a young person in Toronto, more around nuclear plants than weapons, but both. We sort of had this green jobs, not pink slips campaign where it was just like, no, we really have to think, and we have to partner with labor. We have to figure out how to build industries or institutions or livelihoods or whatever that offer alternatives. When in 2020, when there was a big push to have cops out of schools in New York City, that one pushback was, well, most of the people who are public safety officers in schools in New York City are Black women. Are you saying they shouldn't have jobs? I was like, could we have a job that's not an overseer of our children? Like, I think that it shouldn't just be like that or nothing, right? So, but I do think it is our responsibility as abolitionists to think through what new economic and social relations look like that sort of eliminate some of the push into those positions, right? And then I do think counter recruitment and conversion is an essential thing. And I think that as we're thinking about this effort that's of the current regime to build this giant private, basically police force by recruiting massive numbers of ICE agents and so on, we have to be out there counter recruiting because the people they're recruiting are people, that we are somehow in relationship with. It might be the guy that you never talk to at the holiday because he's terrible, but you have to figure out where there's systems of influence to pull them back, right? I don't think we can just sort of hope they'll go away, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so that doesn't mean that I necessarily want to do it or you necessarily want to do it or who's going to do it. I think some of the most effective work happening in the US now is the work of veterans and former guards people who are following around members of the military who are being deployed in various cities, speaking to them as someone who is their peer, saying, what are you doing right now? This isn't what we signed up for. This is not what never mind what they signed up for, but like they're just sort of, starting a conversation, and then they can bring someone in to be like, is this what you thought you should be doing? Like, is this, and really just doing that work of relational counter recruitment. So I think we have to do that. And I think that's part of building a world and economies and societies that are not premised on the continued existence of prisons, of militaries, of policing, and of, border management. And it requires us to create something that is compelling. And one of the ways that it's compelling is that it's going to feed you and your family and allow you to have a livelihood and convince folks that organize them to the notion that their livelihood should involve, their own humanity and recognizing the humanity of others rather than their entire identity and livelihood being premised on dehumanizing and violating other people. But, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it. It's not easy, but it is work that I think we have to do or we're doomed.
Absolutely. I'm going to read two questions and feel free to answer one of them or both. So the first question is, if there's no alternative to police, is there an alternative to security? What does a better form of security look like? Is it possible to change security, or should the idea of security be abolished as well? And then the other question is, could you speak more about practices of accountability, especially in settings of asymmetric social power? Ray, we'll start with you. As I said, feel free to answer either one of those questions or both.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the security question. And I think, the question I always ask when people raise security issues is security for whom, and what does security mean to that group of people or that person? And I think you get very different answers depending on who you're talking to. And for a lot of people, I think, when certainly a lot of the prison police writing and activism that I've learned from, when talking to communities about security, it's about safety, right? It's about being able to um, have a job, buy food, go to school, be safe in your neighborhood, not be threatened by the cops walking down the street, just trying to go home or trying to go to work, not being under threat of ICE deportation, being able to leave your house if you're an immigrant. So I think, security, that is security, but it's like people talk about it more as safety. And I think, in the global, like international security discourse, it's so state-centric, it's so dependent on weaponization, militarization. Um, and the concept of human security was introduced into that world in order to try and challenge it. And that concept has done a lot of work to shift things, but has been insufficient on its own to, I think, really address the structural problems of the way security is treated in the international militarized space. And so I think when we are talking about security, it is those questions. If we're saying, oh, we need nuclear weapons for our country to be secure, for what part of the country, for what elements of this country? Do you mean for the United States government to be able to invade other countries, or for the Russian government to be able to invade Ukraine, or Israel to be able to commit genocide in Gaza? Because that's the security that nuclear weapons are providing. They're providing security for those governments to be able to inflict tragedy on other countries and places and people. And then, the security then, the insecurity that is derived in the communities that are sacrificed for uranium mining or radioactive waste or nuclear weapon testing or development or deployment or what have you. And so, yeah, I think it's always about interrogating security for whom and what does that security look like, and bringing it back to security as safety. That's sort of the recommendation I would make around that.
Thank you, Ray. Andrea, would you like to answer both of those or either of them?
You'll have to remind me of the second one afterwards, but I think
Sure.
that the question of security, I mean, is whether we're talking about security or safety, I think we have to contend with the fact that, like, it is not possible to be perfectly safe at all times from all forms of harm. But we've been sold in a kind of protection racket situation, this idea from both the police, the state, and the kind of global militarism or military industrial complex, that it is possible if you just give us more money, if you just give us more power, if you just sacrifice more money for bombs as opposed to, healthcare, if you just believe in the military more, then you will achieve, it's possible for you to achieve safety. And it really is an extortion racket. Like, every week they come back with more demands for us to give up our power, to give up more resources, to give up more of our collective well-being in order for this elusive promise of security or safety. But I have to tell you all, we're on a piece of rock hurtling through space at millions of miles an hour. Like, there is not, like, safety is relative, right? And so I think we need to think about how we create a world in which as many people have access to the things that Ray was describing as possible, and that we are as intentional and care-based and accountable and reciprocal in our relationships with each other as possible. And then, I don't know, the saber-toothed tiger still might jump out at us, right? But maybe if we're together, we can negotiate something or figure something out in that situation that allows everyone to survive and thrive. And so I think we have to let go of this bill of goods that we've been sold that's not possible, right? We're humans, we bump into each other, we do harm. The goal is to minimize that, interrupt it as soon as possible, prevent it as soon as possible, interrupt it as soon as possible, and heal and transform from those conditions. But the notion that it's possible to create a world where even some people don't experience any harm at the expense of all the rest of us is not a just world, right? And whether we're thinking about that in relationship, global North, global South, 1%, 99%, white communities, Black communities, rich communities, poor communities, like that's not going to actually generate what we want. So I think that's important, but it is relational, and it depends on how you are in community with other people, and so that's an important thing. What was the second question?
The second question is, could you speak more about practices of accountability, especially in settings of asymmetric social power?
Well, that's where we have to build power. And I do think this is the part that sometimes also gets away from the conversation around abolition. Abolition is not a conversation that doesn't take into account structural relations of power, right? We're focused on how those are maintained and how we disrupt them. But it requires us to build power too, right? And to build enough power, and that includes many forms of power, right? It's economic power, it's social power, it's political power in small p ways, not necessarily elected officials, but power to generate and make ideas real together. And I would say spiritual power, ancestral power. There's many different kinds of power: the power of the imagination, the power of a positive vision, as someone said in the chat. And so, but we have to recognize that we're contending for power. So, yes, we are facing a giant machine. We have definitely been out-organized. We have definitely been overwhelmed by a giant machine. And we have still, as Ray said, managed to shift some things by building power towards our vision. And we need to be focused on how we do that, and that we do it in ways that are about building power with, not power over, because otherwise we're just going to replicate the same thing. And then, to collectively build that in ways that can shift the system. And so I think there's one person in the chat who's sort of asking, but my perennial question is, how do I increase my impact? And that is the question you should be asking yourself every day. You should be thinking about where you have power, where you have systems of influence. Do people listen to you at your book club? Then bring in some stuff at the conversation, like in your family, in your community, on your PTA. Can you get more power by being elected to a school board, to a library board? But most importantly, you get more power and impact by joining with other people and figuring out where you then can collectively exercise power. Can you walk off the job? Can you build a culture of non-compliance? Can you not participate in or allow some of the things that are happening that you don't want to happen, whether it's ICE enforcement or criminalization in terms of access to care, or deprivation on your block, right? Like, there's many ways that you have power, and we have power, and we should be thinking about how to increase our impact every day in ways that are consistent with the vision that we want. And the number one way to do that is to get with other people and bring more people into the vision, and bring more people into the vision, and to continue to act in every way towards the world that you want.
You kind of were speaking to this a little bit, and I really want to caution us on sort of scalability, and this like large desire that people have to enact an impact based on making things bigger, constantly making things bigger and replicating them in other areas. And so I guess I'm saying this to ask you this next question with this in mind, which is Alice is asking, what are the next steps now that 7 million people marched against fascism this week? Ray, would you like to start?
Can I just jump into this, because I'll be quick.
Please do.
And it is that it's connected to what I just said. And someone else mentioned the Chenoweth data in the chat, et cetera, about 3.5%, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to be clear that that data, and Chenoweth themselves has pointed this out, is based on situations in countries where people are way more organized than they are in the United States, right? So that 3.5% of people in the streets is like Italy, where like 3.5% of the people in the streets who say they're going to shut the country down for Gaza actually are connected to enough people to make that happen through their unions, through their workplace associations, through their student movements, through their other forms of social movement, that they can actually, that 3.5% people in the street is a statement that much more can happen because we represent millions more and we have built enough power to shut things down or to stop business as usual or to practice non-compliance in a very impactful way. So I don't think it's enough to be that there were 7 million people in the streets on a Saturday listening to music, holding very cool signs, wearing very cool frog outfits, and talking to each other and showing their children the value of saying something is not okay. I'm not dismissing it. Like being out there and saying, I'm not down with this program that's happening right now, and showing that is a form of power, but it has to represent power to then take it to the next step. And so kudos to all the people, including myself, who are out there flyering there being like, and now why don't you come to this training, to this meeting, join Migra Watch, join this, join that, because that's how we build the power to make that 3.5% actually mean something. So the next step is go organize with your community, figure out what it is that needs to be blocked, what needs to be broken in your community, what needs to be built, who you need to build a bridge with. What do you need to do in order to stop the machine and protect people from what it's delivering right now, and then fight and build the things that we want and need? So that looks different in every community, but it is ultimately about building power together. But tell us, Ray, what you think.
I 100% agree with that. And, you know, I also think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier too, about this is not just a problem of fascism, right? Which can be sort of like this no kings framing, or the fact that so many people are standing up. Like, yes, it's absolutely important, but also I'm sure many of you saw like some liberal with the sign being, you know, if Kamala Harris was president, we'd be at brunch. It's like, okay, so I think we have some work to do with the folks that are out at the No Kings protest who feel that way, and a lot of them legitimately do. I know I have people in my life that feel that way, and that disconnect between the fact that there, you know, is hundreds of years of harm that this country has been producing up until this moment, and as much as that's amplified now and sort of catching more bodies and harming more people and creating more pain for more and more groups, we can't just ignore the fact that it existed before. What's happening now is built on a bipartisan structure of pain, of profit for billionaires at the expense of people, of neoliberalism and neocolonialism and coups in other countries, and all of the aggressive warmongering, destabilizing political actions that this country has overtaken for many, 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 many years. And that has to be part of the analysis that's brought into, you know, the 7 million, the No Kings, and the work that's being done now. So yeah, totally agree. Great to see people on the streets. Great to have that feeling for your moment, standing next to your neighbor with a sign saying this is not okay. That's so important. But it absolutely can't stop there. And there's so many ways for people to engage right now. I think that's the other thing, is you don't need to look far to figure out how to plug in at various levels, depending on your time, your skills, what risks you have, etc. But I think that the options are increasingly visible thanks to social media. You know, we can see what people are doing. And it's really up to us to figure out how we can best lend ourselves to the movements that are already out there and the revolution that has already started.
Thank you so much, Ray. We are getting close to running out of time. We have about 10 minutes left. So I guess I just want to ask both of you sort of if you have any final thoughts after this great discussion that you would like to share with the participants. Andrea, would you like to go first?
Like, should I end controversially? Or I guess I want to say, one, how grateful I am for this space to make the connections between militarism, this notion of like nuclear deterrence is no more effective than, the notion that prisons deter violence; they produce it instead. And really trying to think about, militarism in continuity with kind of the struggles people are having on the ground around policing, prisons, ICE, et cetera, and to understand them as of a piece and with different issues that we have to contend with. So I just want to say that's really important, and it's been lacking. As I sort of said at the beginning, I have come in through anti-war work, and then somehow, don't necessarily always think of myself as doing anti-war work as an abolitionist, when in fact that's at the core of it. I do want to say, repeat what I said earlier, which is that, criminalization kind of paves the way for fascism and authoritarianism. And Ray really talked about that. Like, what was happening under the previous administration not only created the machinery and the infrastructure that the current regime is able to take and mobilize in the United States and in other places to their end, but it also created some degree of complacency within all of us that it's okay to do these things to people if we decide that they're a threat, a terrorist, a criminal, a rogue state, etc. And that, again, I don't want to return to kind of just a low grade fever of state violence, right? Like, I think I want to clear the infection. And so that means we can't buy into criminalization as a solution. Criminalization got us here. Criminalization is what's keeping us here, and criminalization is not getting us out of here. We are not going to arrest our way out of a genocide. We are not going to arrest our way out of fascism. And the more we try and do that, the more we're feeding the thing that we're actually supposed to be fighting. We're trying to fight. We're giving it legitimacy. We're giving it power, and we are deluding ourselves, frankly, because criminalization works the same at every level. I don't know if you've ever paid attention to who winds up in front of the International Criminal Court, but the demographics are somewhat similar to who winds up in front of any criminal court in the United States that you've been in, or frankly anywhere in the world, right? And some people will never appear in front of that court, and we see that right now. So there was this question about, like, what do we do about rogue states? I'm like, you mean the rogue state that is committing genocide before our very eyes and is flaunting and completely, laughing in the face of all international systems because they weren't created to actually penalize them or to hold them accountable or to do any kind of consequences for violence. And yes, I'm talking about the US, but I'm also talking about other occupying entities, and there are many of them around the world right now. So I think we have to stop believing that there's some way to prosecute or criminalize our way out of this, whether it's at the international level, the state or local level. And we have to find another way, a way that actually is about our power, real power, not the illusion of power that criminalization gives us, collective power that is about how. So I think the Samud Flotilla, for instance, is an example. I know there's critiques and we can talk about that in a separate conversation, but that was people saying, our states aren't doing anything, so we are going to do something, and people do that around climate. People do that around, land defense, water defense. There's ways in which we can come together and say, well, we're going to try our best to build the world and that we want. And I'm not minimizing the consequences that come down on people when they do that in that example or any other example. What I'm saying is that we're not going to get there by trying to use the machine that is actually producing the thing that we're fighting.
I don't know about all of you, but I think I'm aggressively nodding so much that I'm gonna have to work on it afterwards. Ray, would you mind sharing your final thoughts?
Yeah, I was just vigorously nodding along as well. Yeah, I don't know what to add to that. I mean, that's sort of the perfect closing framing for us. But I guess, one of the things I was thinking about that you were saying earlier, Andrea, about the ways that people like insist that we have all the answers and we have to figure out everything before we can take on one piece of it. I think that's just such an important thing for folks that are thinking about abolition or curious about abolition to remember. There's this real hostility that like anybody who is challenging a system of oppression, it's like other people who are being harmed by the system, or, you know, just, I don't know, they just like they find themselves, it is a policing thing, a self-policing thing, right? It's like we've caged our imaginations and people respond quite aggressively and they're like, well, um, unless you have, you know, a clear model that can be implemented tomorrow that's going to fix all the problems, then I think we'll just stick with this, right? It's like, it's really, it's so baffling. I think it's baffling to people who have done the work to uncage their minds, but we have to remind ourselves that our minds were once caged too. And I think that's part of the joy of abolition for me. It was of letting my own imagination determine my actions instead of feeling like I had to um, uh, color within the lines in order to be taken seriously in a particular space, right? And I think once we can push ourselves beyond that boundary, it becomes easier and then it becomes second nature. And then you become frustrated with everybody that's not doing it. So I do think that that's part of like the journey to abolition for some of us. Maybe some of you were born abolitionists, and congratulations for that. And I think, you know, the joy of it also is this idea that it is like abolition is imagination, it's hope, it's creative, it's collaborative. So I think there's this sort of reaction as well to the framing of abolition that it's all about like tearing something down, when really it's way more about building something up. It's what are we doing instead of this? And the excitement that you can get from thinking up what those alternatives would be and how to achieve them and what we need to be building, the power that you're talking about that we need to be building together in order to do that. And that every single person can be a part of that experiment, of the million experiments that we need, as Mariam Kaba often says. Everyone except maybe the billionaires and the fascists, but everyone else can be part of designing the new world that we want to build together and live in.
Wow, the both of you are so incredible. If you have your camera on, can you just give a round of applause? And if you don't, maybe send a nice emoji to the speakers. And we also just really want to thank Greta and World Beyond War for all of their incredible work. I hope that you leave tonight with a deeper sense of what abolition is, what it can be, not just what we're fighting for, or fighting against, but fighting for, you know, safe and liberated communities. Thank you all again, and we look forward to building with you. Just a reminder, we have like an incredible performance right after this, so make sure you stay. But thank you so much to our speakers and everyone who is here.
Thank you so much for that powerful discussion, and thank you, Bea, for moderating and staying up very late for you to do that.